In this session, we get to the two probably most famous stories from the book of Daniel. So famous, but also so similar, I think, that many people probably sort of conflate them in their head. It's the story of the three young men in the fiery furnace in chapter 3, and Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6. In many ways, they are virtually the same story, certainly the same plot, the same theme, just the details are slightly different. And most interestingly, perhaps, the characters are different. In fact, in chapter 3, the story of the three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there's no Daniel at all. What is a chapter without Daniel doing in the book of Daniel?
Well, it shows you what you had here originally was a collection of stories about Judeans in the Babylonian court. Mm-hmm. And, this one wandered in somehow. It was similar enough. I think a lot of people who read the book of Daniel nowadays don't even notice that Daniel isn't in that because it's so similar to what happens to Daniel. And so, the three young men are kind of hanging on in the book of Daniel by their fingertips. Yeah. In a way, they're superfluous for the most part. You don't really need them. But evidently there were stories about three young men, and that's where they come from.
Yeah, there are these. Yeah. They are sort of mentioned here and there. Daniel and his young men, his young friends, and these various people. It's not unlike, to a certain extent, I would say, David and his sort of band of warriors, where we end up with stories about the warriors independently that are actually very similar to some of the stories we get about David. That is, these extra characters that are fleshed out in later storytelling.
This is really the only attempt to flesh out the three young men, though.
Yeah, but it is a fairly famous one in which the king sort of issues a decree that, whoever does not bow down to the gods will be thrown into the fire.
Now, leaving aside the fact that it's into the fire, mm-hmm. There's very, very little precedent in the whole history of the ancient Near East for a king threatening to kill somebody for not worshipping in a particular way. The only example really I can think of from the pagan world, so to speak, is Akhenaten, mm-hmm. back in the second millennium with the cult of the solar god, where there was an attempt to suppress other deities. Mm-hmm. And you could point to the case of Josiah in the biblical tradition, where there's an attempt to purge the cult in Jerusalem. But for the most part, this is not something that they did.
Right, so then what do you make of that? What do you make of a story that raises sort of worship of the native foreign gods into a sort of a demand by the king? What's the message of that?
It seems to me that this reflects, the great fear of Judeans in a diaspora or in a foreign context. Now, it may seem a little paranoid to us. It probably didn't seem paranoid to them. But now you'll get exactly the same fear in the book of Esther, where it says in the Persian period, we have no evidence whatsoever that the Persians ever threatened to kill people who wouldn't worship in a particular way.
Right.
But still, this fear is there because this is, the one thing that they really couldn't do. Now, at various times, if Daniel and his friends had agreed to eat the king's meat, it's conceivable. Esther doesn't worry about that stuff at all.
Exactly.
But worshipping the pagan god was the one clear no-no that all strands of Judeans who wanted to remain Judean at all agree on. And so that's the great threat.
Yeah. That exaggeration of sort of policy, if you will, I think fits in with some of the other exaggerated, and again, we might even say comedic elements of this story. It says something like, they're supposed to bow down every time they hear the following instruments play, and then goes on a list of 7 or 8 instruments: the lyre, the zither, the harp, and it uses the list over and over again. It's such a ridiculous sort of element of the story. How does the humor work here?
I think the humor works in making the Babylonians seem a bit ridiculous. The idea that you put up this statue and then you bring all this orchestra and every time you have the whole thing play. It's kind of laughable. Now, of course, what you would like to know is the idea of people walking alive out of a fiery furnace. Is that comedic or ironic?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people would find it incredible, I'm sure.
Sure.
But I don't think it's meant as comedic here.
No, I don't think so. So maybe we should at least briefly recap the story, which is that they are in fact thrown into the furnace for, as we expect, refusing to worship. But they are not burned, and the fire is said to be so dramatic that even the men who threw them into the fire are themselves burned by proximity to the flame.
Yes.
But then, the king looks in and sees not only the three of them, but a fourth figure also. This sort of undefined fourth figure. Who is this mysterious character?
And it says that he looks like a son of a god.
Right.
So it really means just a divine being. So the idea, and you get this actually spelled out then in the prayer in the Greek version, is that God sends his angel to cool the flames, and that preserves them. Needless to say, a lot of Christians I had a more specific identification for who this one like a son of God was.
Sure. When they come out of the furnace, and they seem to be able to walk out on their own power, Nebuchadnezzar's response is fairly dramatic. He sort of seems to convert in a fairly straightforward way.
He does, and it's not his only time. Because already, in fact, at the end of chapter 2, when you might have expected him to get mad and say, you're saying that my kingdom isn't going to last. Instead, he says, no, I'm amazed that your God could reveal this. Let's all worship the God of Daniel. And it's the same now at the end of chapter 3. And you'll find this is the regular reaction of Gentile kings throughout the books.
And again, one of the things that we've talked about repeatedly already at this point is there is no historical veracity to the notion that Nebuchadnezzar, of all people, or Darius, or any of these foreign kings would have ever converted to worship of Israel's God.
And, let's not even press the word converted. Would have ever honored, appreciated, done anything to indicate that they thought that this was the true God. Yeah. So this is wishful thinking. Actually, the most extreme case of that is in the second book of Maccabees, which is one of our main historical accounts for the later period. And that actually claims that Antiochus Epiphanes, on his deathbed, decided to become a Jew. And that's pretty far-fetched. There's one other little detail, though, on the three young men in the fiery furnace. Before they get into it, the king, what they tell the king is, no, we are not going to follow your order, even though they say, our God is able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to follow it. Now, presumably in the story, they think he really is. But it's quite a remarkable nuance.
Yeah.
And I think maybe with a little touch of realism.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense. I mean, you brought up Maccabees. It looks ahead to some of the stories in Maccabees of the martyrs, right? The people who were willing to accept that God was not going to deliver them now, but they were going to not worship anyway. It's very much akin. Now, the second chapter we're talking about here, chapter 6, we don't need to go through the plot, in part because we just did, right? It just changed the three men to Daniel, change the fiery furnace to a lion's den, and take away the angelic figure. And there you have it. Essentially the exact same thing in which Daniel is tossed in, not because he won't worship, perhaps. It's a little bit more complicated, right? There's issues with, it seems as if there's just jealousy of Daniel on the part of sort of the other wise men.
Well, in fact, they say explicitly, we won't get anywhere find a charge against Daniel unless we find it in the matter of his God.
Right.
Now, that I think is very interesting. There are an awful lot of people nowadays who say you can't distinguish between religion and culture in the ancient world because religion was normally part and parcel of culture. But it seems to me that the Judeans in the diaspora do precisely that. In all other matters, Daniel is willing to be the perfect servant of King Nebuchadnezzar.
Right, he's honest, he's diligent.
Yes, anything you want to do. But when it comes to the worship of his God, now the particular issue here is, can he pray to somebody other than the king? Now, and of course the king, whenever the courtiers ask the king to issue an edict, he says, sure. And it's then a law of the Medes and the Persians that can never be changed. This is a nice way of setting up the dilemma.
Right. And it's actually very much the same dilemma that we have in Esther.
Very much.
Right?
Very much.
It's a sort of satire of monarchic, how monarchs ruled, especially, I think, in the Persian period.
But now the other thing to be said about Darius in this case, he's a remarkably nice guy.
Yeah, he really doesn't want.
He's really cut up about this.
Right.
He's troubled about it.
Yeah.
And then he goes along to check, and
he hopes that Daniel will be okay. He says, "I hope that your God will save you."
Yes.
Again, much like Esther, right? The king's hands being tied by his own law.
That's right.
Which seems like a very sort of common Persian satire. At the end of it, of course, the ending is the same. Daniel comes out of the lion's den, and the king, realizing that Daniel was saved, throws the people who committed Daniel into the lion's den. He throws them in, and they are, of course, immediately devoured, as is the way of these stories. And the king, what do you expect? Converts.
Yeah. But notice now the relationship between the pagan kings and Daniel. The assumption, I think, in all of these stories is that the king at heart is good. He has evil courtiers. There are underlings who are jealous of the Judeans and will conspire against them. But Daniel doesn't have a problem with being in the service of Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar or Darius. This is not revolutionary material. Foreign rule, is what's supposed to be for the present, and you can go along just fine with that. And the thing is to get a benevolent monarch. That's what you hope for.
But it's also, in a sense, literature that clearly, as you're describing it, clearly written in that foreign context. And in a sense, if you're going to write a story while living under foreign rule, the one person you don't want to say is a bad guy is the king, right? It seems that this is, they could have made them into bad guys. Nebuchadnezzar, of all people, if you were going to make into a bad guy. But there's a sense in which just the role of king, we really want to say is decent. There is both it seems there's both internal communication going on, right, written by Jews for Jews, but also in case somebody else outside should happen to read it, we want to make sure it sort of passes the censors.
And there's no treason here, no hint of it. You will get this again in the Greek-speaking diaspora in Egypt a couple of hundred years later. The book of 3rd Maccabees is another example of the same genre. And again, it's the wicked courtiers, or the king sometimes, gets drunk and does things when he isn't really in charge of himself. But at heart, you can work with them.
So it's also, in some senses, a call for the Jews to be treated well, or continue to be treated well, or be treated better.
Yes.
We are loyal. Look at, we say nice things about you. Look at our stories. Look at how loyal Daniel is. Right? We're okay, right?
Yeah. And at the same time, it's saying to the Jews, you can still pray to your own God. You can refuse to worship the other gods, and the king will actually appreciate it.
Yeah.
He'll know that this makes for real loyalty. This is really what you want to have.
Yeah. In the chapters that we'll deal with next, we find a slightly different image of the king. It goes through some slightly different episodes. We'll get to those in the next time.
And even already within the tales in the first half of the book.
That's right.
Yeah.